Thank you to the Pennsylvania Soybean Board for sponsoring our 2025 Crops Conference and Crops Days events. The Pennsylvania Soybean Board is responsible for the proper allocation of soybean checkoff dollars. This farmer-led board preserves and advances animal agriculture, identifies and promotes sustainable practices that provide ROI to farmers, promote biofuels through partnering opportunities, and drive new initiatives to increase the value and understanding of soy. Check them out online at pasoybean.org. Sponsors like the Pennsylvania Soybean Board allow us to host the annual Crops Conference and Crops Days events across the state. These events recap the 2024 PA crop production season, give insight to the latest agronomic research, products, and technology, and offer attendees pesticide recertification credits. If you would like to learn more about these events or to register, visit extension.psu.edu/crops-2025.
Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Spelman. I'm joined here with my lovely co-host, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
Good. Everything in the West is great. We're moving towards spring. Things are starting to green up, and we're really excited about coming out of what has felt to be an incredibly long and difficult winter, and looking forward to this conversation pairing that we've got right now of forage and spring assessments, and that's kind of getting me jazzed up for thinking about spring and better weather and green grass.
Yeah, for sure. Nothing like talking about forage and grain assessments to really get us excited about getting back into the field and getting out of the snow, right? So this is part of two episodes we have in store for you guys today. So our other episode that's out today is with Dr. G and Dr. Daniela Carrijo. They talked a little bit about what to do once we have some information about our stands when it comes to our forages and our small grains, kind of how to take some of that information and run with it, make our decisions early on in the season. And so in this episode, we're actually going to dive into the nitty gritty of exactly how we take some of these assessments. Okay, so I don't know, Justin, when you're taking these assessments earlier in the season, what are you usually looking for? Is there anything that comes to mind of how you utilize these tools?
Yeah, so I don't want to take anything away from our guest that we have joining us today and what he's going to go through, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can look at this, and perhaps as we kind of separate this out in these terms of qualitative versus quantitative, right? And I think immediately we kind of joke about this 55-mile-an-hour scouting or something like that is what we're doing, but from this kind of superficial or this veneer kind of an aspect of this, there is a lot that we can kind of tell from some of these things, just actually blowing past them going down the road, right? If you've been growing these things for a while or you've looked at a bunch of fields, it's really not that uncommon to be able to spot some bad spots in that field, see some anemia, like that little yellow look or something to them when they're coming out of their dormancy. When we start getting into that quantitative, so like the counting of the tillers and the plants, like that's when we really have to be out there. But we're going to let Zack Curtis tell us about that. And Zack's joined us a few times on the podcast for various things. I know he's done some equipment with us. We've talked about forages a lot. But Zack, go ahead and do a quick introduction to refresh everybody of who you are, what you're doing, and where you're doing it from.
Hey, thanks for having me on again, guys. My name is Zack Curtis. I am a field and forage crops educator here with Extension. I'm based out of Wayne County, but I work quite a bit with producers all over the Northeast. Anything from forage crops to field crops, just like Justin and Ryan, I do hay, corn, soybeans, wheat. We tend to see it all out here in our jobs, and trying to put all the pieces together to figure out how we can do this stuff profitably.
That's right, and I think Zack, at this point, with the amount of times he's been on, we can upgrade him now to friend of the show. Okay, we'll start a new category of friend of the show, whether he likes it or not. Okay,
so if you think about Pennsylvania and the counties, Zack would be in the furthest kind of northeastern corner that you can get, and I would be in the furthest southwestern corner that you can get, right? Like as far diagonally apart as you can almost be as far as counties are concerned in Pennsylvania, and Ryan somewhere in the middle, right? So today we've got a pretty good kind of cross diagonal section of Pennsylvania represented. So let's kind of jump into it, Zach. When you're thinking about the visual assessment, right? When you go out and you start surveying fields, and we're going to jump back and forth a little between forages and alfalfa and grass and things like that, compared to things like small grains, oat. Well, excuse me, not oats, but wheat, barley, that kind of stuff, or rye. Where do you start? What's the first thing that you look at as your indicator? Is, hey, we need to get out there and we need to start taking a peek at what's going on.
I think the best piece of advice I ever heard for crop scouting was that you have to know what looks right in order to know what looks wrong. And so, like, for any one of our major field and forage crops, I always try to keep that in the back of my mind. Depending on the crop stage of growth and depending on the crop that we're looking at, we should always have an idea of what looks to be normal, right? We want, if we have, early growth corn, we want something that's got that nice deep green color to it. It's got adequate growth. It's got good leaf and nodal development. If we're looking at soybeans, we want vigorous growth. We want leaves that are not being chewed on by anything. If we're looking at hay crops, we want a nice, dense, vigorous stand. And then depending on the time of the year that we're looking at, we should have expectations of how tall that crop should be or how much growth we should see coming out of it. Now, that being said, we know that plants are typically green. If we're doing things right, plants are going to look green. So if anything is a color other than green, it stands to be examined. So if I see yellow, brown, maybe like a pale white, purple, any of those colors that aren't green, I'm going to try to get in there and look a little bit closer on a localized basis. On a field-wide basis, I always also look for uniformity in that crop growth and crop development. If you get out into a 10 or 20 acre field and you start seeing variations in growth stage or variations in height and color, those are definitely the areas that you want to hone in on to make sure that you're getting in there to figure out what's going on. Here in the late winter, early spring, I think the areas that need the most attention are any of the low-lying areas in that field or areas that are going to gain or gather water and where water is going to be laying for an extended period of time, because that can bring a host of issues like plant suffocation and disease development, nitrogen and sulfur losses. So I think, especially at this point in the year, if I'm concerned that we had extreme weather and we had some stressful conditions, I want to get out into those low-lying areas first.
So, Zach, one of the things that I've seen a lot, and I don't know if this is maybe more to my region or call it just an observation. This year might be different, but over the past few years, what I'm seeing is what I would consider more like root freezing damage than I am like actual like heaving and actually like above ground, right? And so as we start to move into March or even into like April in some of our areas, we kind of thaw out. We get a lot of rain, we get a lot of moisture. These soils get really saturated. They take a bunch of this water, and then we get this really cold snap for like the next 3 days. And as we drop down to those like 10s, 20s, it seems like it freezes all of the roots. And then like that becomes more of the problem because they come out of the spring and they look really good. Is that a real thing that's happening, or what's going on there that caused that? Because they seem like they wake up and then they die and then they just never come back again.
Yeah, I think you just summed up life here in the northern tier, right? We do a really good job. We have March all the way into June some years, but I would be careful of that. It's just like you draw the analogy over another crop like fruit trees, right? If things get a little too warm too soon, and all of a sudden you have cold weather later on, it's going to really stress out that crop development. Be considerate too of how much snowpack you have on the ground. Like this year, we were a little bit more fortunate. We've had more snow up here than years past. So when we had those 0 5-10 degree stretches of weather. We had a little bit more insulation. I don't think anything, at least in the north, has really started to wake up from the long nap just yet. But certainly, I think that February and March can sometimes make or break a lot of our crops because that's when we start seeing those fluctuations in temperatures. And I would say if there's any time of the year to really pay attention to those crops in the winter, it's definitely that late February to mid March time period.
So to just kind of summarize some of the stuff you're saying here, it sounds to me like when we ask the question like when's the right time to go out and start surveying the field, you're saying like there's no better time than all the time, right? So we need to start looking once we don't have any snow cover. We can start to assess, okay, it's getting a little bit warm. Are we seeing some of these plants wake up? Okay, we should probably keep an eye on that. If we have another freeze, look at some of those wet spots. Do we have damage associated with that? And then maybe as we get into our months of green up, now we're really looking to see what's going to come back to life and what's not. So maybe we can start to talk about that. So when we're in our green up stages, maybe can you talk about what kind of differences you might be looking at when we're talking about forages or small grains at what's giving you clues that you're going to have a good crop, a productive crop, or maybe there's areas that you need to put some of your attention.
Well, hopefully we would see everything come out of dormancy at roughly the same time. Um, I don't think it's a bad idea to try to pay attention to the base temperature requirements for our common crops, like um, for things like wheat and alfalfa. That base temperature is around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, to try to get out there and figure out when that crop should start coming out of dormancy. If you get out there and you see, I would say if you see those plants coming out of dormancy and you see a variation of more than a week's time for one area of the field versus another, get into that area that still looks a little dull, still looks a little lifeless. Figure out what's going on in there, and that's when I think you need to get in and look a little closer to figure out what kind of plant health signs and what kind of stressors are present that might be causing that delay in breaking dormancy.
Now, what about for small grains? Is it kind of the same process for small grains when we're looking at maybe the break of dormancy? Are there other clues that we need to look for to indicate whether we're going to have a good productive crop there?
I think that's a good rule of thumb that you can use for forages or small grains. I mean, phenologically speaking, a small grain is still considered a grass, so we would expect it to behave somewhat similar to some of our hay fields or pastures.
So Zach, as we mentioned, this is this two-part podcast. And if you've listened to both now or wherever you're at, but one of our forage specialists kind of the question came up, and I had done some reading, and that some universities in some areas use this 3 consecutive days above or around 60 degrees, right? And so there's a few different ways you look at like growing degree days or heat units. Um, our specialist, Daniela, her recommendation is using a 2 week average above 40 degrees. The only caveat to that one, and we kind of talked about it a little bit on the other podcast, is it's not as easy to just get on the internet and say, what's my average temperature for the day? Right? You actually have to do a little bit of math to look at your highs and your lows and take that out over 2 weeks. And so I think overarching, and to reiterate what you said, the answer is once you start to see things greening up, you need to be starting looking, right? We can't wait any longer than we have to, especially if we start getting into some of these quantitative assessments and we realize, hey, we're going to have to go out here and do some interseeding or some termination or something like that, right? The longer we delay, the harder those decisions may be.
I think the worst case scenario would be that the first time that we do that scouting in that field is when we pulled in there planting the top dress with nitrogen.
Well, one thing can be said, at least we are pulling in there planning to top dress. But no, point well taken. I do, right? And that is a very interesting thing, and something we focus a lot on. This is the economics of our fertilizers and the economics of our grain costs and all of the things. If ever you are going to take a year and practice or invest your time in scouting, this is as good a year as any, right? Understanding what your tillers are, what that means as far as bushels and percent maximum of harvest, as well as what you need to invest in this term of opportunity costs and what you may be losing or wasting by not making the proper assessments.
So maybe this is a good time to kind of transition. And now that we're talking about, okay, we're at the point where we're seeing green up. Now, what are some quantitative things that we can do to really assess that stand? So maybe we'll start with wheat or small grains and talk maybe about the technical aspects of how do we actually get a stand count. I know in that other podcast that we record, we talked about that if we have a stand count of less than about 14 plants per square foot, that's grounds for possible termination or thinking about something that we can do to that stand. Now we need to know how to get to the number, right? So could you maybe, Zach, walk us through how that works, and how we can reliably do this?
Yeah, so fortunately for us, taking stand counts for small grains is pretty easy. As long as you have a yardstick and a notebook and a pencil, you can measure the stand counts for your own small grain fields at home. So start by laying out that yardstick next to a row of that small grain, and count the number of plants that you find along the 3 foot length of that row. Record that number and repeat that process in at least 5 other areas around the field, and average the number of counts from across the field. Once you have your average stand count from across the field, multiply that count by 4 and take and divide the product of that value by the row width in inches. So let's say I measure 25 plants for my average plant count. I multiply that by 4. My product is 100. And if I have 7.5 inch rows, I will divide 100 by 7.5. And I find an average plant count across the field of 13 plants per foot of row.
And so based on what we know and kind of the discussions we've had, is 13 is right on that edge, right? We're kind of thinking that 14 number is the bottom side. And we'll put all these tables in there of where this information comes from and how you can use it to help you walk through this. But basically what we're saying is when you get down to 14 plants per foot, what starts to happen is your maximum yield off of that crop starts to be in this like 40, 50, 60%. And that's where we start to have concern. And that's where we start to say, hey, maybe we should be thinking about another crop.
So
So,
I want to just pitch this before we kind of move on to the next piece here. You mentioned taking these counts in 5 different areas of the field. When I think about taking assessments, usually I'm thinking about scouting for diseases, and where the recommendation was always to pick random parts of the field, no matter what they look like, and then just go with those, and maybe you pick like a zigzag pattern. Would we kind of use the same kind of idea for this kind of assessment when we're kind of picking randomly? Maybe we're avoiding some spots or not. I don't know.
Well, there's the general guidance is that you want to count areas that look average to the rest of the field. And I guess the funny part there is you don't really know what the average is until you go through and take the average. But anyways, I think it all depends on the year that you're having, and you should have a pretty good idea of the kind of investment that you have tied up in that crop. You should have a pretty good idea of what that crop would be valued at by the time it's ready to harvest and sell. So be objective, right? We preach this idea all the time when it comes to soil testing, right? Garbage data in produces garbage data out. Try to be very objective with yourself and be critical. Is this stand something that I think is worth keeping? Is this stand going to make me money by the time it gets harvested and sold? If I go through all this work and I come up that I'm at that right at that threshold, I'm at 13 to 14 plants per foot, and there's a chance I'm not going to recover my cost by the time harvest comes around. Just think about what average means to you, because every farm I think is going to have a slightly different idea of what that means. Just be objective so that way you can be fair to yourself.
I think that is a wonderful frame to put that in, Zach, and I might steal that for some of my conversations. Is this point of like the day that you take your assessment is the time to be the most honest with yourself in the direction you see this heading. Because every dollar you put into it from here is a dollar you're going to lose if you can't make what you need to, right? Like every bit more that we continue to invest is more that we have to make back to kind of break even. And sometimes these hard truths are now's the time, right? And we just have to kind of come to this realization of just like what you're saying. If I took 5 stand assessments and I'm one of them is showing 18 and another one is showing 12 and I'm averaging, 15, 14, maybe you take 5 more, right? Maybe you look at some different areas or something. Maybe you go back and you really pencil out what your weed is and make sure you don't have contracts that you're obligated to. Pencil out some of these costs of the urea or the ammonium sulfate or whatever you may use for that. But that point is the cheapest and the easiest it's ever going to be to terminate that stand and move on to the next. I think that's a wonderful opportunity way to look at that.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think your context matters. Like you mentioned here that you can pick your best area of the field and take a sample there, the worst area of the field, and then just think about what that means to you, okay? What that means to you and what that average means and whether there's a part of the field that you want to do something with that's different than the other part of the field. All right, so now maybe we can move on and talk a little bit about our forages. Okay, so we just talked about how to take an effective stand count when it comes to a small grain. So is it the same process when we're looking at a forage, or are we going to take these measurements a little differently?
Yeah, with forages, I mean, we still have this idea of thresholds, minimum plants per square foot to make that economical economical to continue harvesting. It's just the numbers change slightly. For alfalfa stands, we're growing alfalfa. If we're getting out there into like year 3, year 4, year 5, I want to count the number of plants and or stems per square foot. Now I say stems and or plants because um, that number kind of depends on the time of the year that we're counting. Sometimes it's easier to count just plants. Sometimes it's easier to count just stems. And if you've ever had the fortune of taking alfalfa stand counts, you'll understand exactly why. It's as soon as that stuff starts budding and producing stems in the spring, it gets pretty tough to see what's going on down there at ground level. If we are counting plants per square foot, the easiest thing to do is to take a small hoop. Sometimes you can find these from industry partners. Sometimes you can find these through Penn State Extension events, but it's just a small hoop, and the area inside is generally 1 square foot. And you throw that hoop down on the field, and you count the number of plants that are located there. Generally speaking, we want to rotate alfalfa out when we have 4 to 5 plants per square foot, because we understand that there are no longer enough plants there to support an economical harvest. If we get later in the spring and plant starts growing, it's out of dormancy, and we see a lot of stems, I'm going to count about 45 to 55 stems per square foot. If I get less than about 50 stems per square foot, I think that's a really good time to think about rotating out, so that way we can take advantage of that nitrogen credit to something like a corn crop afterwards. I've heard of people trying to, if they're not ready to rotate alfalfa out yet, they might try to interseed another crop into there to keep it in production for another year. I guess that's kind of up to you, but we're looking for plants and or stems per square foot. Again, I want to take 4, 5, 6 counts from across that field. I want to look at areas that are representative across the field. And in this case, it's fair to skip those low-lying areas that we expect alfalfa to be declining in. For grasses or pastures or hay fields, it's fair to take a frisbee and just draw a little arrow on it with a Sharpie marker and throw that around the field in 10 different areas. I want to see a desirable forage at the tip of that area, at the tip of that arrow, in at least 7 places around that field. If I go and throw that frisbee around the field 10 times and 6 or 7 of those arrows are pointing at a weed or something that's not desirable forage, it's probably time to renovate that field.
Awesome. That's actually the first time I heard about this frisbee method. So I'm all about that. The more I can throw frisbees out in the field, the more agronomy I'll do. Okay, so there's my incentive. So Zach, I think one thing that we need to keep in mind when we're working with a forage is that oftentimes we're talking about a perennial system, right? Something that's been in the ground for multiple years, and something that we need to be thoughtful on what the condition of that plant's crown is, right? And how vigorous that plant is itself, right? So if we're doing this early enough in the season that we're not starting to see a lot of green up yet, are there ways that we can maybe assess the quality of that stand, the quality of some of the plants in that stand, their ability to come back earlier in the season?
Yeah, so any one of these plants, whether it's a small grain or forage crop, you can dig it up if you're concerned about plant health. Either you've had a hard winter or you've had some conditions where diseases might be more prevalent, or if you've had conditions like last week, we had some periods of time we had a lot of ice sheeting out in our fields, and we were concerned that we'd have some suffocation of those plants from that ice sheeting. Um, you can go out there really at any time of the year and dig up those crowns of whatever that plant is, whether it's a grass or a legume, and dig that up and just split it open. I always like to look for bright, white, firm, healthy tissue in the ground of that plant. So if I take an alfalfa taproot and I split it in half, I should see firm white tissue from edge to edge. If I see voids in there, if I see anything that looks brown or mushy or has like a rotting appearance to it, I have some kind of pathogen present, and I can expect that that plant probably isn't going to survive for another 1 to 2 to 3 years, like a healthy plant would. If I get looking at grasses or small grains, and again I get into like discoloration, that mushy appearance, it's probably it's probably got some kind of disease. It's a great question for Ryan because he loves his diseases. So send pictures of that to him, ask him what's going on. But yeah, again, the key I look for is bright, white, firm, healthy looking tissue.
So one of the neat things, I don't think this is new. I think it's been around for a while, but as sometimes we say, what's old is new again, is this concept, excuse me, this concept of a bag test. And I don't know why this has been fascinating me so much, but as we were going through, I know we're talking about spring green up, but indulge me as I tell the story of how this kind of concept came new again. As we were going through our drought last year and our heat and all of the stuff that came from that, there were a lot of questions around this thing of did this seeding die, right? Did this orchard grass die? Did this Timothy die? And Zach really took on this kind of initiative with another one of our colleagues, Andrew Frankenfield, and pulled up these old things and this stuff where they've talked about this bag test. And every time someone asks me about this now, I said, "Well, just do a bag test, right?" And I look incredibly smart, and they're like, "I never heard of such a thing." But it is a very easy thing to do. I'll admit, like I've done them with random pieces of grass and different forages out of people's fields, as well as stuff out of my yard. I've tried them with different types of forages, some that I knew were like a warm season perennial grass, like some blue stems or something like that, to see how they would respond to others. So, Zach, tell us about the bag test and tell us how that works and how we can use that and when that's going to be helpful in our forage and seedings.
Well, if you are wondering whether or not you have forages or small grains that are still viable after a period of extreme stress, we found that this bag test is kind of a handy way to figure out what's going on if you still have any viable tissue left in that. Sometimes when you dig up a plant, it's pretty obvious that it's dead, right? It's kind of like got like this brown, dry, crispy appearance to it, or if you pinch it between your fingers, there's a lot of give in there when you pinch it. But basically, what we do is you take that plant, you dig it up, and you rinse the dirt off the root ball. Then you trim the leaves and the roots to within about 1 to 2 inches of the crown, and put those damp samples in a Ziploc bag. Leave the bag slightly cracked and place it in an area that's at room temperature but out of direct sunlight, and check back about a half a week to a week later to see if you have any regrowth. If you have a viable plant, you'll see some nice regrowth on the leaves. You'll see those roots kind of regrowing and seeking out nutrients. It'll be pretty obvious if you have viable forages or small grains left in that field. If you come back a week later and it's uh, still looks brown and crispy, it's most likely dead.
I'm not trying to simplify your science, but like that is just such a unique, such a such a simple thing, right? And we're always I do work with youth and education in that area as well. But we're talking about like how do you get kids involved in agriculture, and this is like just been fascinating me. It's such a multifaceted tool that we can use. Is not only can we check our stuff, but we can bring it in as like a mini science project in the house for our kids or grandkids to see like just how these roots are actually developing below ground, but in this bag, how fast and how quickly they respond. Like, I mean, I think this is just such a cool thing that even if you're not worried about your forages, I think everybody should go out and get a couple of these. Get one you know's dead, get one you know's alive, get a few different ones, bring them in, set them close to the windowsill, and everybody should be doing bag tests this spring.
Yeah, as long as you got a pair of scissors and a Ziploc bag at home, you can do that.
But I
Yeah,
think this is such a cool technique. I think it's such an easy thing. You know, we often think about with our agricultural problems or these assessments or this kind of stuff. This is too hard of an answer. I need to call someone. I'm not saying don't call us by all means. Keep calling. But these are just very quick, easy ways for you to get very definitive answers. And I think that's what makes extension and what we do and what Zack does so amazing is anyone can do this at home and you can get some pretty great results.
yeah. I mean, as long as that plant is still viable when the moisture and the warm temperature returns, whether it's in a bag or in the field, I mean, we should have a viable a viable stand and hopefully get some economical production out of it in the following season.
So I think that's a great place to kind of wrap this up. If you listen to this and say you've done your bag test or you've done some of these stand counts and stuff, I would encourage you to listen to the second part of this with Dr. Guji Wong and Danielle Corriggio about what we do now, right? And so if we're talking about Zag's bag test and you come back and you took 10 samples, but only five of them grew, what are our options, right? Can we interseed? What can we interseed? Can we terminate? What do we terminate with? That's what they're going to go through a lot of this with us and kind of help us conceptualize and talk about what these things look like and when we need to make decisions and how we make those. So I really encourage you, if this was interesting, to check out that next one. Ryan, what are your thoughts?
That's right. I think that's a great place to leave it off, and definitely check out that other episode. It looks like Zach might have some last minute thoughts here.
Yeah, the only thing I guess I'll chip in here before we go is that if you get out in your field and you find areas of localized or widespread damage, try to figure out what caused that. Because if you have issues present, I mean, this bag test is fun, but it's not something that you want to be doing every year, year over year. So if you have if you have forage or small grain losses, figure out what's causing that. Try to address it. If it's a management issue, or if it's like something that just sporadic, like disease or pest or moisture related issues, that's one thing. But if some of these issues are born out of mismanagement or fertility problems or putting the wrong species or putting the wrong variety in the wrong environment, try to address that before the next year, so that way you're not dealing with these same issues perpetually.
Yeah, that's a good point that this isn't just something to do this year and then forget about it and then do it again next year. Keep track of what you're seeing year to year. If you're seeing some similar problems, and if you see something out of the ordinary, as you start to do this, you'll start to know what your average is, right? Earlier we talked about this with stand counts, but even just quality, right? As we understand what average is, we'll understand what looks weird. And I'll make sure that I add a link to our plant diagnostic clinic in the description as well, because if you see something out of the ordinary and you suspect it's a disease or a pest, we did talk about how you can do your own little science experiments at home with this bag test, but again, we do have resources that you can send samples directly to a lab here on campus if you're in Pennsylvania and get a result on if it's a disease or a pest. So we do have those resources available for you. And so, yeah, Zach, thank you for that last note. I think that's an important note to add here. All right, well, I think that is a great place to wrap up here, and we'll leave you with the message of you can be a scientist too, okay? This is something you can do in your field, and have fun with it. Well, thank you guys for listening to this episode, and we'll see you guys on the next episode, or maybe that other episode we're putting out today of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.